Hello and welcome to our live MailStore webinar. My name is Dave Warren. I'm a senior support engineer with MailStore, and I'm going to be walking you through an introduction to the product today. Just to let you know, we do keep everyone else muted to keep the background noise down. If you have any questions, go ahead and ask them at any point in the question and answer box, and I'll get back to you at an appropriate time. So today we're going to be looking at MailStore from the end of the installation process through the initial setup and configuration. We'll start off looking at the administrator's perspective. We'll talk about some of the common things to look at for in the user interface, the things you're going to want to pay attention to and that might be not immediately obvious, but to be aware of. We'll show you how to set up some users and talk about the different ways that you can synchronize users, as well as manage them manually within MailStore, and then also the privileges that you can assign to users and how that'll impact the user's experience. Of course, we'll show you how to archive some messages. We're archiving from an on-prem Exchange environment today, but we'll talk about the other options that are available, including the cloud-hosted options. We'll show you MailStore from the user's perspective as well. So we'll start off here with the MailStore client. This is the standalone Windows application, and it's actually the same tool that we're using on the server as an administrator to manage MailStore. We'll take a look at it though from the user's perspective as well, because it can be used without admin privileges, just as a way to access your own archive. It is more of a power user tool, but we'd like to sort of cover the capabilities that are there. We'll look at the Outlook add-in, which is probably the most common method of accessing MailStore. Obviously, it ties users into their familiar Outlook experience. So it's quick and easy for most users to get up and running. You mostly just have to kind of point out where it is, how to get to it. And then we'll also take a look at the web access as well. We'll also show you how to export messages out from MailStore. So again, we want to sort of cover the fact that you can access MailStore, you can bring mail in and access it, but you can also get your data out into other formats as well if needed. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about the storage technology and the search indexes, the where MailStore is storing data and how that works, and the search indexes that you might want to set up. And with that, we're ready to jump right into the live demo. So I'm going to start off by launching MailStore Client. This will be launched automatically at the end of the installation process. And for the very first login, you need to log in with the credentials admin for both the username and password. This has to be done on the machine where MailStore itself is installed, so that we can set up our own initial admin password. Once we've set up our own administrator password, it's actually possible to install MailStore Client, this tool we're using here, on your own workstation, or even connect over the internet if you have the appropriate firewall rules set up. So you can do all of the administrative tasks. Everything else we're doing today can be done from your own workstation, or it can be done by using a remote desktop into the machine where MailStore itself is installed. So when we log into MailStore Client, the first thing we see is the start page, which contains the dashboard. This has a bit of an overview about the particular server that we're on, just so we can see some details about the environment. In particular, we can see the current version and a link to check for updates. Or if we had automatic update checking turned on and a new version comes out, it'll be shown here as well. We can get a bit of an overview about our archive status. So in particular, we can see that we don't have any messages archived just yet, but of course that'll change as we go on. We can see the number of archive stores. So we just have one created right now. In larger environments, you'll see additional archive stores get created over time as necessary, although small environments might actually be fine with just the first archive store. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the storage technology section. And also notice that everything here is going to be linked is underlined because it's a link. So when you come across a message, for example, if you want to set up your SMTP settings, you can just click on that and be taken to the appropriate place in the interface. The message section will just highlight anything that MailStore thinks you need to be aware of. There's a couple of informational messages right now, just letting us know things that aren't set up but could be. You might get warnings and error messages as well if there's any problems, depending on what's happening in your environment. In the compliance section here, we can see that archive access by the administrator is disabled by default. So what that means is you as an administrator can set up your users, you can start archiving mail, but you can't actually look at anyone's mail in MailStore other than your own if you have messages in your own archive. If you want to be able to look at mail belonging to another user, you can do so by unblocking access. So you just click on this, it'll take you to the compliance section and follow through the steps. Same thing if you wanted to manage your retention policies. These are basically just shortcuts to get you to the right place in the interface, or you can navigate there under administrative tools. Finally, we'll talk a little bit about the licensing. So I'm licensed here on a demo license for up to 100 users. So MailStore is licensed on a per user basis. In most cases, this is going to be based on the total number of employees that you have within the company. A license is required for each user who you're archiving mail for, or for anyone who's going to log into MailStore if they aren't already covered by having a license for their own mail to be archived. There's no difference in licensing, whether you're using journaling or mailbox-based archiving. It's all based on the number of people whose mail that you're archiving. We can also see that we have premium service in this particular installation. When you purchase MailStore, you automatically get at least 1 year of standard update and support service. You can choose to purchase 1, 2, or 3 years, and either standard or premium support. The standard support includes tech support by email, as well as to access to new versions as they're released within that first year, 1, 2, or 3 years that you purchased. The premium support offering is fairly similar, the big difference being it also adds phone support, as well as a priority response to emails. When you approach the end of your update and support period, we'll send you an invoice that you can renew to purchase additional years. Or if you don't renew, you can keep using the version of MailStore that you have installed forever. It's not a subscription to the software itself. You're just accessing new versions as well as technical support. And if you need to get a new version down the road or access tech support in the future after you've expired, you can purchase an upgrade at that point at a discount from the original purchase price. In most cases, it does work out cheaper in the long run to maintain your update and support service, but you can, of course, get in touch with our sales team or take a look on our online store to see a breakdown of the pricing and kind of understand how that'll work in your environment. So for a brand new install, the first thing we're going to do is head over to Administrative Tools and get some users set up. I'm actually going to go to Directory Services first, and from here we can synchronize our users. I'm going to be synchronizing with Active Directory today, but it's possible to synchronize with a variety of other sources. Of course, Microsoft 365 is fairly popular, but you can also synchronize with Google Workspace or a variety of on-prem servers and LDAP to sort of catch most of the other environments out there. Note that you do not necessarily have to synchronize with the same directory service. It doesn't have to match up with where you're archiving from. So you can do configurations like synchronizing with Active Directory and then actually archiving from 365. So MailStore is actually pretty flexible there. Again, if you have any questions, get in touch with our support team for a more advanced install. But today we'll just keep it simple. We'll link to Active Directory and an on-prem Exchange. Connecting to Active Directory is actually really straightforward. We don't need to worry about the server name, protocol, or base DN. They'll be detected automatically in most cases. The one thing that you may need to change, though, is the authentication type. So if you happen to be installing MailStore on a domain controller or on your Exchange server itself, then Windows authentication will work just fine. Your machine already has the needed privileges. If not, then the easiest thing to do is just switch MailStore to standard authentication, create an Active Directory account, just call it MailStore Server, regular user, no admin privileges, and put in those credentials here. And this will allow MailStore to be able to talk to Active Directory to list users. In this case, I'm actually running on my Exchange server to keep the number of virtual machines down. So everything will work fine for me here if I just leave it on Windows authentication. We can control what users will be synchronized from Active Directory into MailStore. The default is going to be to synchronize Microsoft Exchange users. So you have to not only have an Active Directory account, but an Exchange account attached to it, as well as users that are visible in the global address lists and are enabled. So in this way, we're trying to not waste licenses on users that don't actually have a mailbox. They might be service accounts or whatever else. But if you have an off-site Exchange server, it might not be synchronized with Active Directory, so you might need to synchronize all users, not just Exchange users. If you want a bit more control over who actually gets synchronized, you can do so by creating an Active Directory security group. So I've done that here, and I've placed just the users that I'll need for this demo into my MailStore users group. This lets me choose exactly who gets a MailStore license, so we can avoid wasting licenses on service accounts or anyone whose mail doesn't need to be archived. Finally, there's an option to automatically delete users in MailStore Server. Anything with the word delete in it will be turned off by default in MailStore, but I typically would recommend turning this option on. What this does is this tells MailStore that when a user falls out of scope, they could be removed from the group, disabled, deleted. On the Active Directory side, we'll delete the user inside MailStore itself. This means the license is freed up and can be reused by the next employee. You're not losing their archived mail. Their archived mail is still retained, even though you're removing the account. And if the user is later re-added to that group or their account is reactivated, their archive will be reattached and they'll be good to go. So the idea here is we want to make it easy to not waste licenses on people once they've left the company. When we run our synchronization, we can see the users that were brought in from Active Directory. If you run a synchronization again, you'll probably see most of your users are unmodified, but you will occasionally see users that have a parameter modified in Active Directory and MailStore is updating on the MailStore side. We can go over and pick a user where we know their password, pick yourself if you can, and just type in your password here. and make sure that you're able to authenticate. This just confirms that MailStore is not only able to list users, but also is able to authenticate against Active Directory. So those are two separate steps. Typically, they'll work just fine, but it's a good idea to make sure that the loop is complete. So you don't actually have to use directory services to synchronize users. You could also create users directly in the user panel just by going to the Create New. You'd enter in the username that you want to create, and then you'd be taken to the same properties dialog. In this case, though, I'm editing an existing user because we'll be using Frank later on in the demo. So we can see Frank's login name. This is what Frank uses to actually log into MailStore. The authentication type here is directory services, which means MailStore has no knowledge of the user's password. Instead, we validate in real time, in this case with Active Directory, to confirm if the user can log in. You can also switch this to MailStore Integrated and assign a password to the user. In that case, this is the password they will need to log into MailStore. It has nothing to do with their mailbox password. Those can be totally different. You can grant users the administrative privilege from here. This would give them access to all the administrative tools that we're looking at today, as well as potentially access to look at mail for everyone in the company. Again, it's really nice to be able to do that, and you may grant yourself admin privileges if you want to manage everything from your own workstation. But of course, keep in mind the ramifications of granting that privilege, that a user could do some damage to the MailStore environment, so you obviously only want to give admin privileges to trusted users. For LDAP-based services, we need to know the user's LDAP DN string. That'll be shown here, and typically you don't need to worry about it too much. It'll be maintained automatically if the user's LDAP DN string does change. So again, it's really just there for review purposes and to make sure everything is working, or in case you need it for troubleshooting. MailStore typically does need to know the user's email address. Even though it's in the optional section, most archiving profiles do require it. And again, if you're synchronizing with the source, it'll be pulled in automatically. If you're creating users manually, you'll probably need to list their email addresses here. By default, users have the privilege to log on to the MailStore server. So this means they can log in with any of our client interfaces to access their archive. If you turn that option off, it still uses a license. It just means the user can't actually access their mail, but new mail can be archived for the user. You can give users the ability to archive their own messages. In most cases, we set up everything from the server side as an administrator, and that's what we'll be doing today. But it is possible to let users actually create and manage their own archiving profiles as well. So if you were in a real small company moving from individual Gmail accounts to your own domain for the first time, you might let people archive some individual Gmail stuff into MailStore itself. That comes up really often in really, really small companies that are very first moving up to their first sort of professional mail service. It's really more of a power user thing, but the capabilities are there. It's also possible to grant users the ability to export messages out again. So without this privilege, a user can look at their own archive, they can look at individual messages, and they can restore a single message at a time. With the export privilege, though, a user can restore messages in bulk, potentially exporting copies of their entire archive. And it's also possible to export to external destinations or to files on disk, for example, to a USB drive that you could then walk out the door with. So you want to be aware of the implications of letting users quickly and easily pull copies of their data. But of course, it's a really useful feature where it makes sense to do so. And finally, there's the delete option. By default, users only have read access to the archive, but you can give people the ability to delete messages as well. This actually has to be turned on twice, once at the account level, and then also permissions granted to their individual archive. By default, the user just has read access to their archive. You can grant users write access, which means they can move messages between folders and create new folders. And if combined with the archive email, it would mean they could actually add messages to the archive. Similarly, the delete option, like I mentioned, has to be turned on twice, and this would let people delete messages or folders from the appropriate archive where they've been granted privileges. We can also give users the ability to access mail belonging to other users. So this can be used to give Frank access to Becky's email, whether she's a current employee, or even if she's already left the company and her user was deleted. If she has an archive here, we can still grant that access. So this is really useful in a lot of cases. We do see some cases where you want managers or supervisors to be able to access employees' email, but it can also be when someone leaves the company and you want to maintain business continuity, let the new employee be able to pick up on existing accounts. You can also use this to share out things like public folders or shared folders or role accounts to the appropriate people that need access. There's a bunch of different reasons, but whatever it is, you can grant those privileges here. So at this point, we have our user account set up, and Frank could actually log in and look at Becky's email. Of course, there's no email yet. So the next thing we're going to do is go ahead and get some archiving set up. So MailStore can archive from a variety of services. We're going to be looking at Exchange today, but you're certainly not required to have an on-prem Exchange. This can be used for archiving from hosted Exchange platforms as well. Although if you're using Microsoft 365, you should use the dedicated profile for that, as it'll integrate with there a little bit more directly. Similarly, you can archive directly from Google Workspace or from Gmail. Gmail meaning that you have an individual account with Google, Google Workspace meaning you're the domain administrator, and can archive for everyone across the board. MailStore integrates directly with some on-prem servers, including MDaemon, Karaoke Connect, and Icewarp. But in general, anything that has an IMAP or POP3 interface for accessing mail can be used as a source, and you can archive that mail into MailStore. We also have a product that we're not really going into today called MailStore Gateway. It's a totally free companion product for use with MailStore, and it just lets you create a gateway mailbox that messages get copied into or that receives journal reports, and MailStore pulls them from there. It's a little bit more of an advanced configuration, and we're not delving too much into that in this demo. But again, if you have any questions, take a look at our documentation or get in touch with our support team, and we'd be happy to help out. You can install MailStore Client, this tool we're using here, on a user's workstation, grant them the archive email privilege, and archive mail from one or more of these on-device mailboxes. You should only use this if you're actually archiving mail for local folders. If mail is on an IMAP server or an Exchange, you really need to use the email servers and have MailStore talk to the server directly. If you have message files on disk or that are coming in from another archiving platform, you can bring those in from here as well. EML and MSG are definitely the quickest way to do that. If you can export from another product into EML, that's fantastic. Mbox files are just about as quick. It's just one large file for an entire folder. Or you can also archive mail in from a PST file. You just have to have a copy of Outlook installed on the machine where you're doing the archiving. PST files tend to be a bit slower, so if you have a choice, stick with EML files, but obviously the PST capabilities are there. So we're going to go ahead and set up an Exchange profile today. The options are going to be pretty similar for the other platforms, although there is some platform-specific differences. For getting up and running for testing, the easiest way to go is the single mailbox. In this case, you just need to put in your Exchange connection information, often just a username and password, and sometimes the server name as well, and you'll be up and running and start archiving your own email right away. You don't typically have to make any changes on the Exchange side. So this is a great way to check out how MailStore works for your own account and get a feel for the interface. What we're going to do today, though, is set up a multiple mailbox profile. The single mailbox profile obviously would need some setup for each individual user. The multiple mailbox profile can avoid that. Instead, we can create a single account on the Exchange server, and I've done that already in my setup here and called it MailStore Server. The reason we do that in advance is there's a couple different steps involved setting up application impersonation on the Exchange side. MailStore technically still supports Exchange 2003 all the way up to the latest and greatest. And the setup process for doing that is just a little bit different on each version of Exchange. So we do have a documentation that'll walk you through the process of how to set up that service account. The one thing to be aware of is that account cannot be an administrator, and ideally it should be dedicated to MailStore. So in the next dialog, we can see what folders will be archived and set some other options. By default, MailStore is going to archive mail in all folders with a couple of exclusions set up by default. In particular, the deleted items, drafts, junk, and outbox. It's recommended to not archive those folders, although you may want to do that once when you're initially getting things up and running if you want to try and capture the contents of deleted items. Ideally, though, we want MailStore archiving mail from people's mailboxes before mail actually gets moved to the deleted items folder. And that folder will tend to contain incomplete emails, drafts that were abandoned, non-email items, and things like that that probably don't make sense to be in the archive, but also they may generate errors because they're not actually complete messages. So for that reason, we do have the default exclusions. If you list any folders in this top dialog here to include specific folders, we'll only archive those folders. If you leave this blank, then the default is all folders. And in all cases, we'll take your list of included folders and then remove the excluded folders from the list. We can choose to tell MailStore to archive unread messages or not. The default is just to archive everything, but if you want to give people a chance to delete spam and junk and other stuff from their mailboxes and only actually consider archiving mail once they've marked it as read, you can do that. You can also choose to archive messages older than a particular date or a particular date range. It's actually fairly common for people to start off using MailStore saying, okay, we're only going to archive old messages. Maybe we'll start off with mail that's a couple years old or something like that. You definitely can do that, but I actually tend to recommend to people that you archive all messages regardless of age. The reason for that is from a user experience, user perspective. If a user's thinking, okay, I know I sent this email to this customer months ago, I need to find, the first time we reminded them to pay an invoice or something like that. You don't want the user saying, well, was that, a year ago? Was that 2 years ago? Was it 11 months or 13 months? They don't, and then having to search Outlook and MailStore based on the date. By archiving everything into MailStore right away, you can ensure that you have MailStore as a one-stop shop to find all of your email. It could be something that was sent years ago or just a couple hours ago, and it'll all be there. Note that we're just talking about copying messages into the archive. You don't actually make any changes to the Exchange side unless you configure the delete option. So again, the default is to not delete anything from Exchange and just copy, but you could tell MailStore to delete messages from Exchange as soon as they've been archived. This is useful if you have accounts that have already been deleted or users that have already left the company and you're cleaning up their mailboxes and bringing it in. Or you can tell MailStore to archive messages immediately and then delete them after some period of time, at some point, number of days after archiving or based on the message age. So you can use this to help reduce the size of your user's mailbox, get rid of the old clutter, and still have users have access to their old content through the archive. So for today, I'm just going to leave it at the default, which is to not delete anything. In most cases, the connection timeout and batch processing should be just left at their defaults. In the next dialog, we can choose what users will be archived by this profile. So by default, the multiple mailbox profile is going to try and archive mail for all users in the MailStore user list that have an email address attached to them. However, you can get a little bit more selective. For instance, you could create multiple profiles, one profile that applies just to certain users, and maybe set some different options. Maybe these are high email volume users and you want to delete mail from their mailbox after 3 months instead of everybody else that you're deleting after a year or something like that. So you can do that by creating a totally duplicate profile, but applying the other one just to specific users. So you can create really complex configurations, applying even to individual folders by having more than one profile that applies to certain sets of users or whatever you need to do. Most environments actually just end up leaving this at all users and applying the same policy company-wide, but the capabilities are there. It's a good idea to have the option to synchronize with directory services before archiving turned on at least one of your profiles. This makes sure that MailStore is running the directory services synchronization so that we discover new users, changes, and when the user leaves the company and their account needs to be deleted. So this just ensures that we keep our synchronization up to date. And then we're good to go. As soon as we click finish, we'll see MailStore start archiving, and we'll get some information in our progress view in just a few moments. So our progress view shows us our 0 of 50 tasks. That's the 50 users that we're archiving mail for. We can see the 5 threads that are running. That's the default, so we're archiving the first 5 mailboxes. As MailStore progresses, we'll see the count going up, and when MailStore finishes the mailbox, it moves on to the next one. We see the number of items processed. That's the number of items that MailStore has scanned and looked at and evaluated. And because this is the first time we're running our archive profile, all of them are going to be newly archived. They're all getting written into the archive. This can get canceled, stopped, or interrupted at any point for any reason. The next time it runs, you'll see MailStore skipping over the messages already in the archive, essentially picking up where it left off. So you can archive on an ongoing basis as well. If you run this profile again down the road, you're not getting duplicates. It just skips over stuff that's already in the archive, looking for new messages on the Exchange side that are not yet within MailStore. So while this is running, I'm going to head back over and show you one more type of profile. So single mailbox, multiple mailbox, and public folders really are all the same kind of concept. MailStore connects to a mailbox in Exchange and copies the messages into MailStore. However, there's no guarantee that you actually get everything in the archive this way. For example, if a user receives a message and deletes it before MailStore discovers it, or if a user sends a message out and tells Outlook, don't save in the sent folder, just send it out, MailStore will miss it entirely. And even if you try and archive from the deleted items folder, even with the sort of things I warned you about before, a user can remove messages from there just as quickly. So if you want to guarantee that you get everything done, you need to set up inbound and outbound automatically, which ties into Exchange's journaling feature. So again, I've got this already set up on the MailStore, on the Exchange side, so that we can just focus on MailStore today. We do have, again, step-by-step instructions on the website that'll walk you through this, but just like before, it does vary a little bit from Exchange version to version. So in this case, we need to set up a mailbox in Exchange. So I've done that already, and we've called it Journal. And we're going to point the journal messages in Exchange using a journal rule to this mailbox. So what that tells Exchange is that as messages come and go, it should create a journal report for each message and send that message into the journal mailbox. The journal report describes to MailStore who a message is to or from and has a copy of the message attached. So because Exchange is creating copies of messages in transit, you can guarantee that anything passing through your Exchange server gets a journal report written and MailStore gets it archived, even if a user's trying to delete messages right away or using rules or something to avoid having their mail archived. Everything that goes to the Exchange server is subject to that journal rule. Again, we want to synchronize with directory services before archiving just to make sure we have an up-to-date user list. Now, one thing about the journal is you may actually encounter messages there that don't belong to any known user. So by default, MailStore is going to place those in the catch-all archive, but you can change that if needed, or set MailStore to just skip those messages and leave them in the journal mailbox. So this can happen for a number of reasons. I run into this in my own environment. I have my own Active Directory, and I joined my scanner so that I can print and scan across the network. That works great until someone walks up to my scanner and sends a scan to their own personal Gmail account. I don't have a MailStore license for my scanner. When it sends internal email, that's fine if the scan just gets archived into a user's mailbox. But when someone sends something to their personal Gmail account, MailStore looks at it and says, well, I don't have a license for the scanner. I can't archive it there. Of course, it's never heard of this random Gmail account. So instead, the message ends up in the catch-all. There's a few other cases where you'll see messages ending up there, and you can grant the administrator privilege to look at the catch-all and take a look. In most cases, you're not going to see a whole lot there. One thing to be aware of is you really do want to turn on the delete option to delete messages from the Exchange journal mailbox. The reason for that is if you don't delete these messages, that journal mailbox is going to just build up forever. It's going to get larger and larger over time. By deleting the messages, you can keep the journal mailbox small and ensure that it doesn't get overloaded and that contents just live in MailStore. However, it is turned off by default just because it's a little bit safer for your initial trial and setup. And in fact, if you're using another archiving product that uses journaling, MailStore can read from that same mailbox if you can just turn the other product off temporarily. That way you can try MailStore out without disrupting your existing environment. When you turn this option on, the next time MailStore runs, it's going to delete all messages in the journal mailbox that are in the archive, even if it's from a previous run. So this will clean up the mailbox for you. We need to, again, set the timeout. The default is going to be fine in most cases. And we can go ahead and just let this run. In this case, I'm just going to set it to run automatically in the background. And we can configure how often that happens. The default's every 300 seconds, every 5 minutes. So that means MailStore is going to finish archiving, and then 5 minutes later, it's going to start again. In this way, we're constantly scanning that mailbox, looking for the messages. So because we're running it in automatic mode, it's running in the background. So in this case, we don't see anything in the progress view. Instead, though, we can look at our current status, which is now in running. And eventually, once this finishes, this will change to waiting. So this is just a normal operation that's profiles running in the background. And if we want to, we can change our other profiles as well. Just right-click and switch them to automatic mode just the same. So you can run profiles interactively if you want to watch them here in the progress view, or you can run them totally in the background. One thing about the progress view, once it finishes, you can go into the details to see what actually happened. So we can get a summary overview of the number of messages archived. We can see that a bunch were already in the archive because I stopped and restarted it. And we can select a user and view what actually happened in their archive. So we can see here for John, he had about 115 messages archived. If we look up at one of these first few users, the messages were already in the archive, so nothing new happened for them. If any users had any problems, it'll show up right at the top, and you get an overview of what happened. So at this point, we have enough mail in MailStore that we can actually jump over to my user workstation and take a look at how MailStore operates from a user's perspective. So the machine with the gray desktop background is my user workstation. And I've already got it set up. I've deployed the clients using Active Directory and group policies so that when we first click on it, we're automatically logged in. So when we log into the MailStore client, we can see that the experience is a little bit different. Our dashboard doesn't have much information, really just tells us where we're connected to in the version. We don't see administrative tools or any of the other features or functions there. But instead, when we look at the My Archive section, we can actually look at Frank's messages. So we can see the messages that we have here in our inbox and a couple of just small sample folders that I set up for test purposes. We can flip through here, and if we find a message we want to look at, we can just click on it to view it in the preview window. We can tell MailStore client what mail client we use. For example, we could tell it we're using Outlook, and we could open messages from the archive directly into our mail client, or we can also restore them directly to Outlook from here. The real power of MailStore, though, is not just flipping through folders, but when you start using the search. So you can do that using the search email dialog, or there's also a quick search in the top left. The search capabilities are going to be quite similar, but of course the full dialog gives you some more controls so you can see a little bit more about what's happening. So for example, we could just look for the word MailStore, and we might want to say we want to just search for that in the subject. We don't care about it in other places. We can tell MailStore what folders we want to search. So because Frank has access to Becky's email, we can look at that here, or we can just look at that from Frank's messages as well. So we can drill down to specific folders, we can search the entire archive, or all readable folders will include everything that Frank can see. You can fill in more details if you know who a message is to or from, the date that it was that's on the message, or also the date that it was added to the archive. So that can be useful in some cases, especially if you do a big import one day and you want to just focus on that. And then finally, we can look for messages that have attachments, or we can even look for attachment file names or attachment contents if you're indexing the contents of attachments. So when we run the search, we get our search results here. Same kind of concept as looking at a folder, but we're finding all the messages from all the different places. So MailStore will show us the folder that a message is found in, and we can click on it to open that folder and find the message in context so we can quickly look at messages sent or received in that same time frame. We can go back to our search email dialog, and we can save this by creating a search folder. So I'm just going to call this MailStore Messages so we can see what this is. So this creates a folder under our search email, and each time we click on this folder, it's going to run that same search and give us the same results. Any messages that have been sent or received since the folder was created will be added to this folder. So it's really running the search live each time. So if we have a search that we're running on a regular basis looking for similar content, or I use this myself when I know I have a meeting with a customer coming up and I want to be able to find all the details, the interactions I've had with that customer, I might have a saved search already ready to go to find the interactions we've had so I don't have to ask them the same questions again. So there's obviously a bunch of different reasons you can use that, but this allows you to find just those same messages down the road or to save search results. And you can actually start a new search query based on one of these previous searches that you can then modify. So the MailStore client is more of a power user tool. It's a little bit more complicated than the Outlook add-in, but it does give you a fair amount of flexibility. And there's a lot of different things you can do with it. Next, we're going to switch over to Outlook, and we're going to take a look at the Outlook add-in. So this shows up as a tab, or in really old versions of Outlook, it shows up as a dedicated toolbar. The first time you interact with it, you'll be asked to log in. Although again, in this case, because I deployed it using group policies and configured that way as well, we're logged in automatically. So when we browse our archive, we can see the similar interface to what we saw in the MailStore client. We can look through our folders and we can see that we have the exact same folder structure here as we have on the user's mailbox itself. Again, we can pick a folder that we want to look at and just view those messages. And it'll be fairly similar to the kind of Outlook experience where you see your folders, your list of messages, and then the messages themselves. If we find a message that we want to interact with, again, we can open a message up and open it straight into Outlook. So this allows us to view the message in a full Outlook window. There are going to be cases where Outlook can view a message better than MailStore, where MailStore can't render certain advanced types of contents. So if that's the case, you can just open the message up. You can also then reply or forward a message right from the archive just by opening it through that dialog. It's also possible to restore messages. This opens the message up in a window represented as this envelope, which we can then drag and drop into a folder. So this lets us restore a copy of a message from the archive straight into our own messages. So the Outlook add-in is hopefully pretty straightforward for most users. You really just have to point them to this MailStore tab. It has all the same search capabilities. We can use the quick search and just type in a keyword, or we can use the advanced search and again fill in just any of the same parameters that we saw. Again, we can drill down to specific folders if we want, or any of the other parameters that you saw in the MailStore client. In the Browse Archive section, we can also see that we can look at the saved search we created in MailStore client. So these are attached to your account and can be accessed from other clients, other interfaces. You can also look at Becky's email directly. We don't have to do a search. Because we've been granted the appropriate privileges, we can read Becky's email and look directly in any of her folders. Because it's a small test environment, Becky just has an inbox, but if she had other folders, those would be listed here as well. So in most cases, we find that you really just have to point users towards the MailStore tab, get them used to the idea they can use it. And once people get in there, they're usually pretty good to go. Most people end up just using the quick search all the time. You just type in what you're looking for and hit enter, and you get the results. I'm also going to take a really quick look at the web interface as well, just to kind of make you aware of the capabilities that it has. So when we log into the web interface, we'll of course have to put in our credentials. We can't rely on automatic logins through group policies and Windows integrated authentication here. The web interface is responsive, so if you're on a small screen, you'll see just one of these columns at a time, and it'll move back and forth. So it is totally compatible with tablets or phones. But when you're on a large desktop interface, then you can see a little bit more information all at once. We can see that we have our saved search that we created. We can just, again, access that same saved search and get to our results right here. So again, we can access everything that's in our account. We can drill through messages, again, looking just for specific folders. And we can, again, just pick a folder to list the messages or work with the search. If we find a message we want to interact with, we can open the message by downloading it as a file, either in EML or MSG format. So this lets us open it into any locally installed mail client. You can also restore messages to your inbox. What this does is this actually emails the message as an attachment, so you can then access it from another device or from your regular mail client. Just like with before, we can look through Becky's email as well because we have the appropriate permissions. And when we go into the search, we can see all the same search criteria are here. It's just laid out a little bit differently. So again, we can pick the individual folders we want, or we can just list our keywords here. So hopefully in most cases, you're going to be able to use the client Outlook admin or the web interface pretty interchangeably. There are a few things that you can only do from one interface or another, but for the most part, they're all going to be able to get the job done. So now we're going to head back over to the server and take a look at a couple more things. So we can switch over to our recent results, and we can see that our journal profile finished as well. And again, we can open up the report just to see what happened. We found a bunch of new messages. We deleted all of them from the Exchange journal mailbox, and everything was successful. So I mentioned before that administrator access to the archive is blocked by default. I'm going to go ahead and unblock it here. This requires putting in the administrator password and an optional reason to describe what happened. And this is now written into the audit log. So it's possible to track if an administrator ever grants themselves this privilege and then possibly accesses email. You can audit a lot more, but that will always be audited in all cases. So one of the things we can do now that we have access to the archive, the administrator can look at other users' email. So we can flip through and look at everybody's messages and folders here. Or we can also use the export privilege to be able to export messages out again. So again, we can export to similar destinations. We could push a whole bunch of messages out back into Frank's mailbox. You could export to local mail clients or even just files on disk. One of the more advanced features that you can do with exporting is it's actually possible to create a search. And I'm just going to focus on Frank's mailbox again, because we know we've got some messages that'll meet our criteria here. So we're going to look for the word MailStore in Frank. Don't need to set up anything else. I find the messages I want, and I can create a search folder here. So I'm going to call it Frank's MailStore. When we go to our export email feature, we can now export messages on that basis. So we could export the messages from the scope of any particular mailbox, or we can just export the results of a search. So by combining the search and the export, it means that you can answer data requests for data, or if you have a subpoena or something where you need to produce certain documents, you can use MailStore to construct that search and then export it in a format that's available to whatever you need. I'm just going to go ahead and dump this on my desktop just so we can see a little bit about what it does. I'm just dumping it as EML files because that's the quickest and easiest. You can export to PST or directly to user mailboxes as well. So this now gives us a folder that contains all the messages that we need. So you can quickly and easily archive stuff into MailStore and get data back out again. And you can export to formats that, for instance, from EML, even though it came in from Exchange or from another source. So hopefully that kind of gives you an overview of the sort of more common day-to-day tasks that users will perform within MailStore. Of course, there's a lot we're not digging into today. The compliance settings, there's a bunch of options we're not looking at too much. A lot of things can be audited in MailStore, and you can review the audit log from here as well. Or you can also audit to the Windows event log and then keep track of that through whatever third-party auditing tools you already use, assuming they can handle the Windows event log. So I'd like to talk a little bit about where MailStore stores data on disk. So the storage location section shows us how and where MailStore is storing data. By default, MailStore installs the master database into a path called C:/mail archive. And then you'll have one or more archive stores that show up as subdirectories under that. So an archive, the master database is all your configuration settings, the list of users, basically everything in MailStore other than the actual messages themselves. The archive store contains the actual messages themselves, the list of messages, the contents, all of the information that's indexed. And MailStore will create new storage locations, more archive stores automatically as time goes on when it's needed. MailStore does this based on the database sizing to optimize for performance. But you can go to create automatically and set a limit for the size. For example, if you were backing up to tape backups, then say you needed your archive storage to be a maximum of 100 gig, you can do that. You can also tell MailStore that I want to put new storage locations at a different path. So by having more than one archive store online and by pushing them to a different drive, different path, you can actually have MailStore span multiple disks. So for example, when you run low on disk space on C, we can just add drive D. We don't have to move all the data. Archive stores are totally transparent to users. I could have one store, or I could have 20. When a user looks in a folder, they don't see the archive store. They just see their mailbox, and MailStore is going to combine the results of all the archive stores. This gives you some performance benefits in very large environments too, by giving you the ability to have MailStore reading data from multiple logical or physical disks, spreading the load across multiple spindles. Most cases in MailStore, you don't have to worry about that. One drive is fine. SSDs are great if it fits within the budget, but even regular rotational hard drives are fine. Take a look at our system requirements. We have a calculator there that'll kind of walk you through the process and give you some understanding of what you need. So in terms of search indexes, that's one thing that a lot of people ask questions about, and you may want to look at some of the configuration here. So MailStore automatically indexes messages as soon as they're archived. There's no separate indexing process. You don't have to wait to be able to search for anything. As soon as it's in the archive, it's searchable. If a search index is ever damaged or removed for some reason, it'll be selected here to show that it's missing, and you can rebuild it. If you want to index the contents of attachments, you can do that as well. By default, MailStore can read text, PDF, and HTML files. But if you want to give it the ability to read things like Office Docs or Open Document format, then you can find the appropriate iFilter. iFilters are available for a bunch of different file formats from manufacturers. So in this case, you go to Microsoft's website and you look for their iFilter pack and you install it on the machine where MailStore Server is running. Once you have the iFilter installed, that gives MailStore the ability to read messages that contain these attachments and index the contents of attachments. There are iFilters for things like zip files. Don't install those. Only install or set up the ones for actual document types. But really, any document type that has an iFilter can be supported here. So MailStore can support just about any file format to index the contents. We do get a warning here that when we've made some changes, we need to rebuild the search indexes to apply those changes to messages already in the index. Any newly archived message, though, will use our new settings. So we'll be able to search the contents of our attachments right away for newly archived messages. And again, we can just rebuild everything if we wanted to. The final thing to consider with MailStore is that you want to be backing up MailStore. So a lot of people ask the question, why would I back up my backup? And it's important to understand there's a little bit of a difference between MailStore's archiving approach to what actually is a backup. The thing about an archive is that when you archive messages in, they stay in the archive forever. That's a little bit different than a backup. Typically, when you delete content from your original directory, it's going to be gone from the backup. It might be in some snapshot for some period of time, but the content is eventually just gone. So archiving is a little bit different because you're just adding messages to the archive. So it eventually becomes the only location that a lot of older content exists. So because of that, it is really important to have a backup of MailStore itself. So we can do that under the storage section by creating a backup. Here we can just tell MailStore the path that we want to place the messages. In this case, I'm just going to call it MailStore Backup. Ideally, this would be on a separate drive or separate storage system, but in this case, I don't have any other drives mounted right now. We can also point this to a NAS or network path within the environment if we want. You can choose to exclude search indexes if you want. Because the search indexes can be rebuilt, it sometimes makes sense to skip over them. Just be aware that if you do that, you will have to rebuild them before searches work. So after you do a restore, things will take a little bit longer. By default, we're going to run backup jobs daily, but of course you can configure that as needed. We'll get a quick warning that the directory doesn't exist yet. That's fine, MailStore will actually create that for us. And then when we run our first backup, we can see the current status here. It ran and it's now going to run again tomorrow. Again, we can review our results and we can just see that it did complete successfully. One note about your backup. My backup completes here pretty quickly because I don't actually have a whole lot of content in the archive yet. MailStore does go into maintenance mode while it's doing a backup. So for a larger database, if there's a lot of changes or a lot of new content that was added, you will get a message about maintenance mode. That's totally normal, and MailStore will get those messages, MailStore will start running again when it finishes, but you will see the maintenance mode message both as an administrator and as users until the backup's finished. MailStore's backup does run incrementally. It's just updating the files that have changed. So subsequent backups will typically be pretty quick, but your first backup after doing a full archive will tend to take a little while. So again, there's a lot more we could dig into with MailStore, and I'd recommend doing that if you decide to go ahead with MailStore and you're really getting your setup up and running. But that's kind of the basic information that you need to know to get MailStore up and running from a fresh install. The one other thing to be aware of here, the only other thing we didn't really set up here is we didn't set up our multiple mailboxes to actually run automatically. So again, I typically recommend doing that once everything is running, once everything's working to your satisfaction, and you'll be able to see how things look. So we'd like to talk a little bit about why you'd want to look at MailStore and to some extent why you'd be archiving in general. So the biggest thing today is we're seeing a lot of companies and a lot of industries have regulatory compliance rules. They're subject to e-discovery, whether it's things like an actual legal requirement, or it just makes sense to protect the company by having data retention. Especially if you're covered by the GDPR, you can use MailStore to archive messages and be the primary data storage for older contents, and then use the retention policies to remove stuff from MailStore once it no longer makes sense to retain it or the GDPR would require you to do so. MailStore also gives you a lot of protection against data loss. Even if you're running on a reliable email service, there's always a possibility users delete something and then need it later on. If you're running your own mail server, this is actually extra important because there's a possibility you'll lose data locally, or that even just if your mail server or service is offline, you can grab copies of your data locally and work with it. So this gives you the ability to have local on-prem copies of all of your important records. MailStore can archive from a variety of different sources. We take a look today at archiving from Exchange, but it's pretty similar to archive from the other platforms. Microsoft 365 takes a little bit of more setup on their side to register as an application. Same concept with Google Workspace, but we have step-by-step documentations for all the different platforms. And we have we have what we call priority support or first support for MDAMON, IceWarp, and Carrier Connect, just meaning that we have documentation that walks you through those platforms and some setup in MailStore that makes it a little bit easier. In general, though, you can archive from any IMAP or POP3 server, from any server out there that actually has email on it. MailStore also simplifies your backup and restore process. So what we mean here is you no longer have to back up PST files from workstations, and if a user ever loses their workstation, loses their PST or their old email, you can just point them directly at the archive. You also will never, as an administrator, have to restore an entire Exchange backup just to get that one important message the CEO deleted a couple months ago. You can point them right at MailStore, or you as an administrator can log in and restore the message to user's mailbox. It's really powerful, though, to be able to let users look through the archive and restore their own messages without talking to an administrator at all. Based on MailStore's ability to search all of your email content, it can help improve user productivity. If you're archiving from mailboxes, then the folder structure is maintained as well. But we really recommend trying to push people towards the concept of just searching for whatever they want. And typically, if they get the right search terms, it's going to end up being much faster. This also essentially gets you away from the concept of mailbox quotas. Because MailStore is retaining all of your data for some fixed period of time and storing it separately off the live mail environment, you can tell users that they can basically delete mail from their mailbox when they don't need it, or use policies on the Exchange side or MailStore side to remove those messages, keeping everything in MailStore on an indefinite basis. MailStore can run on a little bit lower hardware requirements than you would need for Exchange as well. So this can help you retain data without the costs and the overhead of running a massive Exchange environment. On disk, MailStore is storing all the data encrypted using AES 256 encryption. There's also a deduplication process that happens at the MIME part level, so it's a single instance storage implementation. So MailStore is storing data on disk a lot more efficiently than is typically done in a mail server. MailStore optimizes for long-term storage efficiency and quickly accessing messages at the cost that things like moving messages and deleting ends up being a little bit less performant. So typically you're going to find MailStore is going to be really quick and easy to get up and to access your content, but it's going to take a lot less disk space and can run on slower disks. A single MailStore server can handle anywhere from 5 to 2,000 users. So in most cases, MailStore's going to be able to grow with you. If you're already close to that 2,000 user limit, you might want to talk to our support team about what it takes to run a couple of MailStore servers. But in most cases, most companies running MailStore have a fair amount of room to grow. Because you can have multiple storage locations online, we can span data across different physical disks. So there's a lot of flexibility, and MailStore can typically work with larger environments fairly well. Everything in MailStore is searchable. You can look from within Outlook, from the web access, and find the content that you want. There also is the ability to access MailStore using an IMAP interface. So you could, for example, set up Mozilla Thunderbird and connect it to MailStore. We don't have an Outlook specific to Thunderbird, but Thunderbird could still list your folders, look at the content, and you can use Thunderbird's own search. So you can have a little bit of flexibility here as far as how you get to your mail. We want to make it as accessible as possible. The Outlook add-in and MailStore client can be deployed using group policies or an Active Directory, or they can be installed manually. All of the interfaces can be made available over the internet. You just have to open up the right ports in your firewall or forward the ports as needed, or it can be available just within your internal network. So we do, of course, some customer service surveys to make sure people are happy with the tech support. And we found that the majority of our customers rate us quite highly. In the last few surveys we've done, it's always been over 90%. So we're actually pretty happy from a support perspective to say that we really, to be honest, I actually really enjoy supporting our customers, and MailStore is a fun product to support. So if you have any questions, you can go ahead and contact myself or one of my colleagues at support@mailstore.com. I work on the North American team, so I'm here probably for most of the people watching this. We also have a sales team that works just from the German office. So if you have any questions on the technical side or product, I'd recommend actually just using the support address. And if we need to get someone from sales involved, we will. If you have a question regarding actually making the purchase, a quote, or something like that, our sales team would be happy to help out. So we do have a 30-day trial on our website. Download it and you'll be up and running in just a few minutes. Or if you have any questions, our support team would be happy to help out. And of course, we provide free support throughout the trial process. So download a trial, start archiving your email today, and let us know how it goes. So I'd like to thank you for attending. And if you do have any questions, like I said earlier, you can go ahead and ask them in the question and answer box at any point. I'll keep the webinar open for a little bit, basically as long as there is questions to answer. Or I can also reach out to you afterwards, open up a ticket, and we can discuss your particular environment. So just let me know how I can help. Otherwise, download the trial, and you should be up and running right away.